Picture someone in your life right now. Maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's someone at the dinner table on Sunday, maybe it's someone you share a last name with. You've tried more than once to be patient with them, generous with them, fair to them, and somehow, no matter what you do, you walk away from every interaction feeling like a slightly worse version of yourself. Here's something almost nobody tells you. The Stoics had a direct, almost startlingly practical answer for exactly this person. Welcome back to modern Stoicism. Today we're getting into one of the most useful teachings this philosophy ever produced. Not on death, not on ambition, not on fate, but on people. Specifically, the difficult ones. Because if we're honest with ourselves, the greatest threat to our peace of mind is rarely the big circumstances of life. It's people. The colleague who quietly undermines you in meetings. The family member who seems to know exactly which button to press. The stranger online who appears to exist purely to disagree with you. The person who, no matter how much goodwill you extend, keeps handing it back to you as hostility. Picture the men who actually wrote this philosophy down. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire. Epictetus was enslaved and brutally mistreated by his own master. Seneca spent years navigating the court of Nero, the same man who eventually ordered his death. These weren't philosophers writing safely from a comfortable distance. They lived through difficult people at the highest possible stakes. And what they figured out, through suffering, through leadership, through relentless self-examination, is a framework so precise that modern psychology is still catching up to it. Stay until the end. The last idea in this video might genuinely change how you see every difficult person you've ever known. The mistake we all make. Picture the most common mistake almost everyone makes the moment someone is difficult with them. We make it about us. Someone says something cutting in a meeting, and we spend the next 4 hours replaying it in our heads. Someone is dismissive over coffee, and we walk away quietly questioning our own worth. Someone is passive-aggressive at dinner, and suddenly the entire evening is held hostage by one comment. Picture Marcus Aurelius, alone at night, writing in a private journal he never expected anyone else to read, working through this exact trap with almost brutal honesty. He reminds himself, again and again, that the disturbance never actually comes from outside. It comes from within. He writes that we have power over our own minds, not over outside events, and that realizing this is itself the source of real strength. Sit with that for a second, because the instinct is to wave it off. Easy for you to say, Marcus, you were the emperor, but picture when he actually wrote this. In the middle of active military campaigns, political betrayals, plagues sweeping through his empire, the deaths of his own children. He wasn't writing from comfort. He was fighting, daily, just to hold on to this one idea. Here's what the Stoics understood that most of us miss completely. When someone behaves badly toward you, two separate things happen at the same moment. There's their action, and there's your interpretation of that action. These aren't the same event. They happen in two entirely different places. Their action happens out in the external world, what the Stoics called ta ektos, the things outside us. Your interpretation happens inside you, in what Epictetus called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, your own mind. And only one of those two places has ever actually belonged to you. This isn't passive resignation. It's something closer to surgical precision. Refusing to automatically convert someone else's behavior into your own suffering doesn't make you a pushover. It makes you genuinely difficult to conquer. The question stops being, why are they doing this to me? And becomes, what am I choosing to do with what they've just done? Picture the opening of Book 2 of the Meditations, a passage that stops most readers cold the first time they actually read it closely. Marcus writes, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself the people you'll deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." Before you call that bleak, picture the very next line, He continues, "They're like this because they cannot tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and I've recognized that the wrongdoer shares a nature with my own, not the same blood, not the same birth, but the same mind, carrying its own share of something divine." This is premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity, the practice of mentally rehearsing difficulty before it arrives, not to become pessimistic, but to become genuinely unshockable. Picture what this actually does, psychologically. Most of us walk around with an unconscious assumption that people will generally be reasonable, fair, and kind. So when they aren't, when they're petty or cruel or small, we're blindsided. We feel personally betrayed, like the world broke a promise it never actually made us. Marcus refuses that setup entirely before his day even starts. He wakes up and tells himself plainly, "Some people today will be difficult. I already know this. I'm not surprised. I'm prepared." Here's what makes this ancient habit remarkable when you look at it through a modern lens. Researchers studying emotional resilience have found that the single strongest predictor of how quickly someone recovers from conflict isn't personality, and it isn't even raw emotional intelligence. It's expectation management. People who mentally prepare for social friction in advance recover faster, feel less personally threatened, and respond far more constructively in the moment. Marcus Aurelius was practicing a kind of psychological immunization 20 centuries before anyone had a clinical name for it. But notice, and this part matters enormously, he doesn't stop at, "They will be difficult." He adds something that completely transforms the exercise. They're like this because they cannot see clearly, not because they're evil, not because they're your enemy, because, like all of us, they're operating from incomplete understanding. Picture the difficult person in your own life through that lens for a second. Have you ever considered that they might not be acting from malice at all, just from a kind of blindness? What yours to control? Picture the opening line of Epictetus' handbook, one of the most quoted sentences in the history of philosophy. "Some things are within our control, and others are not." We hear this constantly. We see it printed on coffee mugs, and then most of us go right back to spending enormous emotional energy trying to control the one thing the Stoics explicitly said was never ours to control: other people. Let's be direct about this for a moment. You cannot make a difficult person stop being difficult. You cannot force someone to suddenly see reason. You cannot legislate someone else's attitude toward you. You cannot turn a hostile person kind, an envious person generous, or a closed-minded person curious, no matter how hard you want it, how well you argue, or how perfectly you behave. This isn't cynicism. It might be the single most liberating idea in all of Stoic philosophy. Picture Epictetus, who spent the early decades of his life enslaved, with literal physical limits placed on what he could even do with his own body. He understood freedom not as the absence of outside limitation, but as complete ownership of your inner response. The story goes that his master once began twisting his leg, simply as a demonstration of raw power. Epictetus reportedly said, calmly, "You're going to break it." It broke. He said, "Didn't I tell you that you would?" No rage, no begging, no collapse. I'm not suggesting that level of detachment is instantly available to any of us, but picture the principle underneath it, because that part is something we can actually practice today. When a difficult person does what difficult people do, cruel, petty, unreasonable, their behavior lives entirely inside the category of things not up to you. It's ta ektos, external, outside your control. Your response, your inner posture, your words, your choice to engage or simply step back, that's prohairesis, your faculty of choice. The one thing that is entirely inescapably yours. This is where the philosophy stops being abstract and starts changing your actual daily life. Stop asking, how do I make this person different? Start asking, how do I choose to respond in a way I could genuinely be proud of, regardless of what they do next? This isn't weakness. A person responding from principle instead of raw reaction isn't passive. Picture them as the steadiest, most genuinely powerful person in the entire room, the only one actually free in it. The particular danger of anger. Of every difficult emotion that difficult people provoke in us, none is more dangerous or more misunderstood than anger. And no Stoic wrote about it more carefully than Seneca. Picture Seneca writing in his treatise on anger, calling it a kind of brief madness, uncontrolled, forgetful of basic decency, indifferent to personal bonds, stubbornly persistent in whatever it starts, closed off to reason or counsel, stirred up by the smallest causes, unfit for either good advice or any kind of fair judgment. Here's the part that lands hardest. Seneca isn't only describing the anger of the difficult people around us. He's describing exactly what we become the moment we let them provoke us. This is the cruelest trick difficult people play, often without even meaning to. They behave badly, we react, and now we're behaving badly too. They've effectively transferred their own chaos directly into us, and we walk away from the encounter somehow feeling like the villain of our own story. Seneca's answer is to delay, not to suppress the feeling, not to pretend it isn't there, just to create a gap between the trigger and the response. He writes that the greatest remedy for anger is simply delay, asking yourself for a postponement before reacting at all. Modern psychology calls this the pause before response. Picture what's actually happening in your brain in that moment. When you're triggered, your prefrontal cortex, the reasoning part of your mind, partially hands control over to the amygdala, your threat response center. The urgency you feel is completely real, but the conclusion you reach while flooded like that is almost always wrong. Seneca knew this 2,000 years before anyone had a brain scanner to prove it. He also offers something even more radical. He tells us not to use anger as a tool, even when it seems useful. In his time, just like today, there was a common argument floating around. Sometimes you need a little anger to get things done, to be fierce enough to push through. Seneca dismisses this with real precision. He says everything anger can achieve, reason can achieve better, and without the cost. Picture the most genuinely respected people you know, the ones who can walk into a tense room and somehow command it, not through volatility, but through calm. There's a reason hard conversations get handed to them. There's a reason difficult people seem to quietly deflate in their presence. They've mastered exactly what Seneca is describing. They've made their own peace into a kind of weapon. We arrive now at what might be the most philosophically demanding teaching the Stoics offer on this entire subject, and it shows up again in Marcus Aurelius. He writes that whenever you're about to find fault with someone, ask yourself a single question first. What fault of my own most closely resembles the one I'm about to criticize? Elsewhere, he writes that anger and grief almost always do far more damage to us than whatever originally caused them. But the deepest piece of all is this. Marcus repeatedly asks himself to look at difficult people not as obstacles, not as enemies, but as members of the very same human community. Picture the Stoic concept of sympathia, the idea that all rational beings are genuinely connected, that we are, in a real sense, limbs of the same larger body. This isn't sentimentality. It isn't asking you to like difficult people, or to tolerate abuse, or to pretend cruelty is somehow acceptable. It's asking you to understand something about human psychology that, once you see it, changes everything. Hurt people hurt people. Every person who has ever been genuinely cruel to you, and this isn't said to excuse them, was acting out of their own pain, their own blindness, their own internal disorder. This isn't a metaphor. It's a consistent finding across psychology, sociology, and neuroscience. People who behave destructively toward others are very rarely, at their actual core, powerful. They're suffering. Picture Marcus holding the literal power of life and death over an entire empire, choosing instead to see the difficult people surrounding him not as enemies to be crushed, but as people who simply hadn't found their way yet. How does this actually help you, practically, in your own life? It helps because compassion and judgment have a hard time fully occupying the same space in your mind at the same time. The moment you shift from, "This person is attacking me," to, "This person is struggling, and that struggle is showing up as hostility aimed at me," you change the entire emotional shape of the situation. You stop being a victim inside the moment. You become a witness to it instead. And a witness has options a victim simply doesn't. 4 practical responses. Philosophy without application is just entertainment, and the Stoics never set out to entertain anyone. They set out to change people. So here are 4 practical responses drawn directly from the source material. First, don't react. Picture Seneca's instruction to create the gap. When someone says something that would normally set you off, pause, breathe. Give yourself 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, ask, if I respond from my best self right now, what do I actually say? Not your wounded self, not your defensive self, your best self. Practiced consistently, this single habit changes relationships more than almost anything else on this list. Second, locate what's actually in your control. When you feel the frustration starting to rise, ask the Epictetan question directly. Is their behavior in my control? No. Is my response in my control? Yes, completely. This isn't a rhetorical trick to repeat to yourself. Make it a genuine reflex. The moment you clearly locate what's yours and what isn't, the pressure in the moment drops noticeably. Third, seek to understand before seeking to be understood. Picture Marcus reminding himself never to be surprised by other people's difficulty and to try, as much as possible, to understand what they might actually be experiencing underneath it. This doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It means that before deciding how to respond, you ask what might be happening for this person that you simply can't see, not to excuse them, but to equip yourself. Fourth, know when to walk away. This one gets overlooked in a lot of popular Stoic content, but it matters enormously. Epictetus is direct about this. Not every battle is yours to fight. Not every difficult person is yours to save or convert. Sometimes the most genuinely Stoic response is to quietly and firmly remove yourself from a situation that offers nothing but ongoing damage to your own character and your own peace. This isn't retreat. It's the wisdom to recognize exactly where your energy actually belongs. Stoicism never asked anyone to be a punching bag in the name of virtue. It asks you to be genuinely free. And sometimes, freedom looks like a door, closed quietly, but completely. I promised you something at the start of this video, that the last idea might change how you see every difficult person you've ever known. Here it is. Picture Marcus Aurelius, near the end of the Meditations, writing one of the most honest sentences ever put to paper. And remember, this is a private journal, written for no audience but himself. He writes to confine himself to the present. In another entry, he repeats that we have power over our own minds, not outside events. And then, most honestly of all, he writes that the obstacle in our path can become the path itself. What stands in the way becomes the way forward. In other words, the difficult person in your life isn't interrupting your path. The difficult person is your path. Every encounter that tests your patience, your composure, your sense of who you are, it isn't a disruption from the work of becoming who you're trying to become. It is the work itself. It's the training ground Epictetus described. Resistance training, but for the soul. Marcus didn't become Marcus Aurelius despite the betrayals, the ingratitude, the cruelty he witnessed throughout his life. He became who he was through them. Every difficult encounter was a fork in the road, a chance to either lose himself in the moment or to find himself again. He chose to find himself, again and again and again. And here's the deepest turn in all of this. The real question this philosophy is asking was never, how do I handle difficult people? It's, who do I become in the presence of difficulty? Because that's the only question in this entire conversation whose answer has always, completely, belonged to you. The Stoics were never asking anyone to become emotionless. They weren't asking you to become indifferent to real injustice, or to smile through genuine abuse, or to convince yourself everything's fine when it isn't. They were asking you to become free from the reflexive suffering other people's behavior causes when we quietly hand them the power to determine our own inner state. Free from the need to always be right, always validated, always treated exactly as we believe we deserve. Free to respond from your values instead of from your wounds. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, none of them had easy lives. None of them stayed at peace all the time. They struggled. They failed plenty of times, and they wrote about those failures with the kind of honesty that, 2,000 years later, still makes a person reading them feel a little less alone. But they kept coming back, day after day, encounter after encounter, to this same discipline, this same choice to remain themselves no matter what was thrown at them. And that same practice is available to you today in your very next conversation with the difficult person already in your life. Not to defeat them, to free yourself. If this genuinely resonated with you, share it with the one person you think actually needs to hear it. Subscribe to Modern Stoicism if you haven't already. We release new content every week. No noise, no filler, just the ancient wisdom that's somehow still holding up.